Welcome everyone to this Fireside Chat with No Fire with Voulet. Thanks for everyone for joining us. We're waiting for people to jump on. While we're doing that, we'd love for folks to share your name, what organization you're with, and what you had for lunch. Oh, smoked salmon. Um, and then we're going to get started. I have some questions that I am going to ask Vu, but if you have questions after, I will pause after a couple of my questions. And I'd love for you to raise your hand and take yourself off mute so then I can see you. I fear if you put your questions in the chat, I will miss it. So I'd love for you to raise your hand, put yourself on mute, and we'll pause and take your questions. So think about the questions that you would love to ask Vu. Again, you're here for the Iowa Nonprofit Alliance event with Voulet, and this is an exclusive event just for our members, so I'm so glad that you are here. All right, I see. First of all, before we start, we do have a couple, I saw a couple of our board members joined, so I'd love to just give a shout out to them. If you could, I saw that Brian joined. I think I might have saw someone else. Your names went really fast across my screen. Oh, Jen Smizer joined, Brian joined, Jordan Degree. Thank you for being here. I hope you'll think of a question. If there's any other board members I missed. Oh, Paul Thielen is here. Thank you so much for being here. All right, I'm going to kick this off. And all right, I'm going to ask Vu. First of all, I'd just like you to introduce yourself, a little bit about your origin story, what you do, what nonprofit AF is, why you started it, what was your inspiration, etc.
Thanks, Bethany, for all those questions all at once. Hi, everyone. I'm Vu. I use he, him pronouns. I'm calling in from Seattle, which is on Duwamish and Coast Salish native land. And yeah, thank you for joining us for this informal, hopefully fun conversation today. If you actually could turn on your video, if you are okay with it, I love seeing people's faces when I talk to see whether things are resonating with them. Don't feel pressured to, but it just feels more fun if I can see your faces. I was born in Vietnam. I spent my first 8 years there, and then came over to the United States after a stint in the Philippines for refugee camp. Then I landed in Philly, then moved to Seattle, then moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and then lived in St. Louis where I got my college and grad school degree. And then after that, I moved back to Seattle, got into an AmeriCorps program for a couple of years, and then started running a nonprofit that was really focused on education and immigrant refugee issues. And that was also when I started the blog, probably about 12 years ago, when I realized that we need to talk about some things that people are not bringing up in the sector. And also to highlight the fun of our sector. There's a lot of humor in the sector, and people here are brilliant, and we don't really showcase that enough. So I wanted to highlight that more.
And
Are those all the questions, Bethany? Yeah.
yeah, I think that was all of them. So, can you share a defining moment from your nonprofit career that shaped your view on leadership or advocacy, or that inspires you, like when you're writing the blog? Like, yeah.
That implies that I'm more organized than I actually am. I usually write the blog 5 hours before I publish it without any sort of editing. So this is just how the my brain works. I would say there's been lots of defining moments in regarding just doing this work. Something that I've been thinking a lot about was probably a few years ago when my organization, which was trying to focus on immigrant and refugee issues and voter registration and so on, we went up to some funders and said, hey, our communities, immigrant refugee communities, are not voting as often.
Mhm.
Can you provide some support? And they said, sorry, that's not really in our strategic plan for this year. It's hard to measure. That's just not something that resonates with us right now. And so none of the funders really went in Seattle. I mean, a few of them did, but not to any degree. And I think it made a huge difference in the 2016 election. You know, And
Mhm.
now all these funders have been scrambling, trying to undo the effects of everything that's been happening over the past several years. And it radicalized me a little bit when I realized like all of these funders that we look up to, and they do not have the answers. And oftentimes they are preventing us from doing the work. They are terrified of advocacy. They're terrified of community organizing. And this is one of the reasons why we have so many fires that we need to constantly put out all the time.
Absolutely. And on that note about funders, I have a note about that. I have a note about what are some of the biggest myths about nonprofit funding and how can we shift these narratives to better support nonprofits?
Yeah, there's some philosophies that we really need to get over because they've been affecting the way that we've been doing this work, and we've internalized them. We think that they are valid. For example, the philosophy that there's only so much money to go around, which has been beaten into all of us. You
Mm,
know, whenever a funder denies grant requests or they won't even open up their cycle or whatever, and they always go, well, there's only so much money to go around. That is total bullshit. There's like $1.5 trillion just sitting in foundation endowments and donor advised funds right now. So
mm,
it's total BS when funders say there's only so much money to go around. There's so much, you
mhm,
know, there's a lot. So we have to stop accepting them when they say that. The other philosophy is that this is other people's money. This is
mhm,
not other people's money. And I am tired of us being told that this is rich people's money and we should be grateful every single time they send us a little bit of it, like a few crumbs of it. When
mhm,
again, I cannot stress this enough, and I try to whenever I can, which is that so much wealth in this in this in this country has been built on like several key inequities here, like slavery and stolen indigenous land, worker exploitation, environmental degradation, tax avoidance, colonialism, and imperialism. So a lot of the wealth that has been built on this country have been built on these inequitable means. So it's not other people's money. If they're avoiding paying taxes, if their wealth was built on like worker exploitation or slavery or stolen land or whatever, then this is not their money. So like we have to stop accepting that all this money that we're clamoring for is somehow a favor granted to us when we get a portion of it.
mhm.
It's like if someone stole our bicycle and then they're like, "Well, you know, if you apply for a grant, maybe we'll give you back one of the handlebars." We don't go, "Oh, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and send in an application." You go, "Where the hell is the rest of my damn bicycle?" Like that is the attitude that we need to have now moving forward.
Well, we just got a question in the chat that says, what can you do when they always deny? And is there some magic that works? Like, how can the nonprofits advocate for themselves in this conversation, is what I'm hearing from that.
Well, this is why I appreciate INA and other advocacy type organizations that are pushing for this. It's just that we need to do more.
Mhm,
We have to organize more. I think
mhm,
about Jan Masaoka, the CEO of Cow Nonprofits,
mhm,
who was talking about um, you know, how we've become so professionalized that we are able to write a logic model or a theory of change or a personnel manual, and we've lost the ability to get 100 people to a city council town hall meeting or something. That we've lost the ability to get like 1,000 people onto the streets or 5,000 people to sign petitions. Like we've lost that ability. Most of us have.
mhm,
And this is kind of where we need to be is like if we're going to do advocacy, we need to do more of it. We need to be more intentional about it. We need to start mobilizing our community so that we can do it effectively. And many of us, we've lost those skills, so they become very rusty. I think we can get them back, but we really do need to practice it more. I think about in Seattle, for example, in the beginning of the pandemic, you know, like all these funders were out there. They were like, "Oh, what can we do? We're in this together." And all of us were like, "Well, we need money." And they're like, "Well, would you like a toolkit?" And we're like, "No, no, actually, we need money. Do you want us to convene a meeting for you all?" And like, "No, money." And they're like, "Oh, okay. Well, we'll think about that for the next 5 years or whatever."
mhm,
And the communities, a bunch of EDs got together and wrote this like open letter that was signed by 280 organizations that said you need to give out more money. It needs to be multi-year general operating dollars. It needs to, do whatever. It needs to go to communities of color-led organizations, disabled people, LGBTQIA led orgs who are most disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And you got to sign this pledge saying that you're going to do this. And they got several foundations to sign the pledge to do this. Like, I think we need to start advocating. We need to start organizing and mobilizing more.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to call any of the funders out, but we know there are specific funders here in Iowa, specifically in central Iowa, that specifically state they do not fund salaries, which I know is, I know, and I'm always chuckle because I'm like, we don't have robots doing, maybe we'll have robots. We fund a robot to do the work. I know that that's something you talk about a lot. I don't know if people on the call know which funder I'm talking about, but they
Oh,
are
there's more than one. There
okay,
are many.
and they're unashamed by it, which I think is also like have no shame about saying, "What, we don't fund salaries." I'm like, well, all we have is people doing our work at our organization. I don't know what to say.
That
Yeah,
is so archaic
I
and
know.
inequitable. And I always joke that if you are living in the medieval ages to the point where you're still like, you're basically in medieval, the Renaissance era, you might as well wear a codpiece or like a powdered wig or something because you look ridiculous, not funding salaries. And and we just need to we just need to start organizing and calling it out. There is a movement that I've been advancing called crappy funding practices that will call out these funders by name publicly on LinkedIn. If you nominate them anonymously, we will do that. Like, I mean, there's a very long list, unfortunately.
That
There's, yeah.
that LinkedIn page gives me so much joy and hope whenever I love it. I bet it's the most, I can't imagine there's a more visited LinkedIn. There's no other LinkedIn page I go to like purposefully. I'll try to find the link to it, you guys, while Vu is talking, but it's great. It's called, yeah, Crappy Funder Practices. And we've had some of them here in Iowa. We've had one where the INA was going to apply for a grant and they asked for our banking information. And I was like, whoa, we haven't even gone on a first date yet. And you already want to know my bank account? I was like, I don't know. I was like, this is how feels weird. Are you promising me money? Is that what's going to happen if I give it to you? And I know a lot of the people on this call can appreciate that. Please feel free if you have, oh, thank you, Amanda Klein, put the link into there to that LinkedIn. I'd love to talk about like some of the experience, like, so you did share a success story in Seattle about organizing together, using the power of the collective to move funders along. However, yeah, are there any other success stories, or what have you found has been the general response from them? Or maybe they're not success stories, but you just all can commiserate with what you've heard.
There are some good funders out there. There is a movement called trust-based philanthropy that has been gaining momentum, and a lot of funders are starting to go that way. And it is focused on starting with trust and not with suspicion, which I believe is the default model for a lot of funders. And that's making some headways. There are other funders who do amazing stuff, like the Robert Sterling Clark Foundation, who just accept a grant that you wrote for someone else, which I believe should be the case. I don't think anyone should deserve their own unique snowflake grant application or their own snowflake grant reports or whatever. We should just have one grant application each. There should be no tailoring for anyone. And the same with the report. It's called the annual report. It's all the data that they need,
Here it is.
right?
Yeah.
And so some funders are starting to get on board with that train, and we need to encourage them and lift them up and get and shame other foundations into going that way, because it is, I think, enough is enough. Like, we've been wasting so much time and energy because funders believe that they deserve to be special snowflakes. Like,
I had
like snowflakes.
We here, I'm going to get to Barb in a minute. A couple things you just said. Barb has her hand raised. There have been efforts for the universal application, I think, in some states. Some of those have not come to fruition because the funders can't just can't decide what needs to be part of the application. But we had a conversation. So, we're a state-based organization, and so a lot of the foundation here was like, oh, we're only this size of state, we only do this region. And so I brought together some of our regional foundations, and I said, hey, we're a state-based organization, we're new. We would love it if you guys got together and worked together, so then you could fund us. And one of them literally said, oh, we've never done that before. And I thought it was ironic because they're always asking nonprofits to come together and work together. Yet these foundations, I was like, why don't you guys come together and then you guys can fund our statewide nonprofit, because it's important to your funders anyway. So I'm hoping by putting the little nugget in their head, they'll maybe think about and I was like, hey, this is something you ask your nonprofits to do, is work with other nonprofits. So let's see how the funders work together. Okay, Barb, I went on my tangent. If you want to come off video or come off mute and ask your question, that would be great.
Yeah, Barb Prather, Northeast Iowa Food Bank, Waterloo, Iowa. Probably not really a question, but a comment, just kind of piggybacking on what you just said, Vu. I think it's important that we lift up the funders that are making changes and bringing them together with nonprofits, because I really believe that there are a lot that are trying that. I also think that with a lot of nonprofits, when it comes to advocacy, they're told that they can't advocate, which is not true. And so it's getting rid of some of those old stigmas around advocacy as well, that we need to all work together. I'd like to see INA lead a workshop put on by foundations that are moving in that direction of encouraging advocacy, but also encouraging the general grant, the trust-based philanthropy, the grant application, and partner with some of the organizations that are getting funded that way, and showing that. I mean, I think that's one way that INA can really lead in this area, because it helps make us all stronger, because all of us have limited time. And if you can do it maybe even in October, it's probably too late for that, but at some point, I think it's a good thing to do, because I think we're all busy as nonprofit leaders and staff people that we might not know it because we didn't hear it and we aren't somebody. So I think that would be a benefit of the association.
That's a great idea, Barb. Yes, and we're just starting to kind of dig into our role as an advocacy leader. That's one of the things I talk about when I talk about what before. So Vu, we're a brand new state association. We will be 2 years old in December. We celebrate our 2-year anniversary. And when I go around the state and talk to funders and nonprofits, when I say there's a lot of things that Iowa is missing out on by not having an association. And a lot of our, like the United Ways, the community foundations did fill some of those gaps with professional development and training and tools and resources. But the one thing no one was doing on a statewide basis was advocacy. There was not one organization that woke up every single morning and thought, what does Iowa's nonprofit sector need to be successful? And that's what the INA does. And we've seen how Iowa's nonprofits have been disadvantaged because of that, because there was no one looking out for you. There was no one advocating for you at the Capitol. There was no one sharing with lawmakers. Just because you cut housing budgets and food budgets doesn't mean that people all of a sudden are magically housed or magically not hungry anymore. It just means it puts more pressure on the nonprofit sector. There was no one sharing that. I mean, I know that as a sector, there were different issue areas, people did share that. So yes, Barb, I love that idea of coming together. And we've talked about that. How can we do advocacy together on behalf of the nonprofit sector with our foundation? So thank you. So Sally said, just a quick note that many funders are also nonprofits, may need to be careful about putting funders in one box and nonprofits in another. That is true. That is also true. Most of our foundations are nonprofits, for sure.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Sally. We should be considered, and there are some foundations that do need to raise funding to give away, and they are probably in the hardest places of all because of that. At the same time, there are clear differences between the funders and the nonprofits, right? So we also need to kind of be aware of that, because some of them will weaponize this idea like we're also a nonprofit. And I'm like, yeah, but you don't raise money. You have $17 billion sitting in your endowment that you're trickling out to people during a pandemic, like during, like, so we can be thoughtful about it and not let them use it as a tool to continue with their really terrible practices.
I remember during the pandemic, I think he put out a blog where talking about endowments and people like, well, they're for the rainy day. And you're like, this is today. Today's the rainy day. We're in the rainy day right now. This is it. We need the money.
Yeah, well, so many of them are so privileged that they're protected from the rain. So they don't even acknowledge that it's a rainy day.
Right. Before I have some more questions, but I want to make sure that we create space for our members here to ask a question. Julie, so I really appreciate the blog post about swearing. Oh, I think I missed that one. I'm gonna have to go back and look at that one because I swear a lot. So I need something to make me feel better about that. So please raise your hand, put it in the chat. You can DM me specifically and I'll see it. All right, let's talk a little bit. One of the things you often talk about in the nonprofit sector is about equity. So what are the key steps? What are some of the key missteps that organizations take when trying to achieve equity? And then what are some ways that they can center equity in their operations and leadership?
Yeah, I think one of the key missteps that I see is that people still don't understand the difference between equity and equality.
Mhm.
They conflate the two. And I think equality is in many ways the complete opposite, and it's like a barrier to achieving equity. Also, we have this idea that we need to be liked all the time by everyone.
Mhm.
If we're going to do equity right, we're going to piss off people.
Mhm.
And if you're not willing to accept that, then you're not going to do equity right. Because true equity is going to piss off people who really believe that everyone should have the same, that they do have the same access to resources. So, for example, when I talk about how funders should really focus more funding going to marginalized led communities, instead of playing this Hunger Games, like
Mhm.
that's equity. If funders say, like, this year we're going to focus on disabled individuals, and so we're going to fund organizations led by disabled people, and that's who we're going to focus on. People get mad because they're like, well, what about the rest of everyone else? Like, what can? And then the funders are like, well, people got mad at us, so now we're just going to open them back up the Hunger Games so that everyone can compete with one another in this cutthroat, because that's fair. That's equality.
Mhm.
So I think my point is that if we're going to do equity right, we will piss off people. And if people are not willing to accept that, then they're not going to do equity right at all. It's like the same with Palestine and the like the protests against genocide. Yeah, I've been pissing off all sorts of people,
Mhm.
but that's like what I have to do. So the other thing is that those of us who have more privilege have to be okay with taking more flack when we do equity,
Mhm.
right? You're going to be punished for it, because who has always been punished? It's people on the margins. It's women of color who've been saying the same things over and over, and oftentimes lose their jobs and so on, and get demoted or ostracized. So those of us, male, white folks, able-bodied, neurotypical people who have more privilege, we need to be okay with using those privileges when we call out inequitable things and move people towards equity. And the second part of your question, Bethany, is like, what are some of the things that we can do? Well, we need to start moving towards equity 201 now. We've been stuck at 101 for a long time. Some of the simple things, 101 things that we can all do is like disclose salary ranges for job postings. That's very easy. Some
Mhm.
people in the sector are still not doing that. Like there's certain things that we can also do, like just add captions to all your images and videos. Make sure that it's accessible to people. Don't list must require 25, must be able to lift 25 pounds, or a formal degree, college degree, when you're looking to hire people, because we know the education system is so inequitable.
Mhm.
And there's certain things that we can all do, but those are like 101 stuff now.
Yep.
And I think a lot of us are getting tired because of just like dealing one-on-one stuff We're now ready for 201, or we should be ready for 201.
Mm-hmm.
And that is way more interesting and way more fun. And what does that actually look like? Look at our fundraising. Again, we've been sucking up to donors for so long because that's what we were told, even while we're trying to do equity work. But 201 is like talking to our donors about where their wealth came from. And maybe they should be doing reparation work and returning stolen indigenous land that their family got. Okay, that's 201. That's really exciting. And I was talking to a friend of mine, a major donor, who went to a workshop where she discovered that her family's wealth literally came from stealing a native family's land. They like took this native family's land, drove them off their land, claimed it for themselves. Of course, the government is going to support them because they're white, and so they've been building their wealth on that. And my friend discovered that by attending this workshop, and now she's made this this decision that when she gets her inheritance from her grandparents, she's going to give 100% of her share back to the native community because it is not her family's wealth. Like, this is where fundraising is moving towards now, ending the Hunger Games, talking about equity, about reparation. This is 201 work. And I think it is really exciting to think about that.
Agree. We have a question in the chat. It says, how do foundations balance the desire to increase grant making from foundations with many stakeholders' desire to preserve assets for future grant making?
Are they balancing it though? I mean, look at and is it a wise thing to do? Right. I'm gonna go on one of my rants, but I think this is my trademark now. Like this, right?
So we're here for.
Right. Think about the environment. I had an argument, like a verbal fist fight with a funder, friend of mine who I'm having lunch with tomorrow. But he was with an environmental organization, environmental funder. And I said, what are you doing? Why are you only giving out 5% of your wealth every year? Why? And he was like, well, there's going to be more issues in the future. There's going to be, still be environmental issues in the future. And I said, there won't be an earth for us to live on, right? You need, as environmental funder, you need to give out all your money immediately to try to change laws and whatever, do like what if you keep at this rate, there just won't be a world that's safe for anyone at all because of climate change and so on. And he kept fighting with me about this because that's what he has been trained by the foundation to think about. Eventually, over the last few years, so this was a win, was like 5 years ago, the foundation had this epiphany where they're like, wow, we really need to spend all of our money right now because there won't be an earth left. And I think this lesson can be applied to every single issue out there. So we cannot let funders just have this sort of moral high ground where they're just like, no, we're thinking long term, like there won't be a future for anyone, And if we think about the difference between progressive funders and conservative funders, the conservative funders understand this.
Yes.
And they spend so much funding because they know that if they change the laws and the systems right now, they will spend significantly less money in the future addressing these issues that they care about. So they spend money packing every single court with conservative judges, including the Supreme Court, because they know they spend, and it's like a long-term strategy. Progressive funders do not do that. So they spend, just like what I said earlier about voting, if they had spent more funding encouraging people to vote and supporting them so they can have access to voting, maybe we wouldn't have the results of the 2016 election. And then we wouldn't spend 100 times more money trying to undo the damages of it. So don't let funders get away with this, like, oh, we got to balance there won't be a future.
Well, and I think even with the stock market, they're making more than 5% a year on those endowments. So
Yeah.
I would think like, yeah, at least spend out as much as you're making this. I mean, I don't know anything about fund, money, so I shouldn't probably be talking about or stock markets or finance. Well, let's talk a little bit more about leadership And so, many nonprofit leaders struggle with burnout. What advice do you have for maintaining resilience in such demanding roles and having to show up for their communities every day when it's really, really challenging?
Thanks, Bethany. I think the frame of this question is kind of emblematic of the challenges that we're dealing with.
Mhm.
This framing of how do we become resilient. I hate it. I'm sorry,
Mm.
not right. Not your question specifically, because it's a great question. I think it's the framework that we've been forced to exist within. It's kind of like, how do you, it's kind of like the same when we talk about children. We're like, they're so resilient. I don't want children to have to be resilient. I
Mm.
want them to be joyful. I want them to be creative and curious. I don't want them to be resilient and to have grit or whatever bullshit
Mhm.
society says is good when children have.
Mhm.
And this is kind of where we are, is this idea that like nonprofits should be resilient. No, we should be able to do our work. We should do our work effectively. And in order to do that, we need funding.
Mhm.
It's so irritating. I was talking to a funder, I think before the pandemic, who called me up and said, "Vu, I'm a consultant, and this foundation just hired me so I could, so we could provide some suggestions for nonprofits on how they can be resilient, such as when funders like drop them, don't fund them anymore. Like, how are they going to be resilient?" And I got so pissed off. Like, I was like, no, you go and tell your funder not to spend $500,000 hiring you and your firm to do a report on how we can be resilient. That money should just be spent on the nonprofits themselves. That's how we become really resilient.
Mhm.
You invest in nonprofits, then we're resilient because we have the money to do our work, right? So
Mhm.
my rant is that like we have to get out of this framework. We got to
Mhm.
stop accepting this sort of like everything has been built around helping nonprofits play the Hunger Games better, right?
Mhm.
Capacity building. And I wrote
Mhm.
about this. Capacity builders, it's just become like this is how you play the Hunger Games better. This is the weapons that you choose so you can stab other competitors better, more effectively. Like this is what a lot of capacity building and a lot of like resilience and sort of
Mhm.
framework has been. Like I want us to work to end the Hunger Games,
Right.
not be more resilient in playing them.
Mhm. No, that really speaks. I'm actually the board chair of one of our statewide LGBTQ nonprofits, and we have, so yeah, so there's been a really challenging few years for us, legislatively here in Iowa. And on our board, we lost over half our board last year to people moving out of the state, people who had to quit the board, because it's traumatic. It is traumatic to have to go and like talk about why you deserve equal rights every single day. And so that's something that we struggle with at our organization, is like, how do we protect our community, but also we need to be showing up every day. We can't not go up to the cat, so that's something that we talk about internally. So I love that one of my board members asked this question. Emily, do you want to come off mute and video and ask your question?
Wait, is that bad?
I think it's funny because you're one of my board members asking me how we end boards, but anyway, that's okay.
I think often when we get into these conversations with the staff at foundations, they seem to get it, be interested, and always say, but my board doesn't, and they make all of these decisions. And then it's always kind of like, well, how do we get to those people who, for the most part, have no incentive to want to change systems? So then if we can't get to those people, how do we end this model where boards are the way we govern nonprofits and foundations? Because I don't know that anyone thinks it's great.
Yeah, this is really tricky because we have so many interwoven layers of crappiness all at once, right? There's like this tapestry of crappy. And I think many of us are trying to figure out like what is that one thread that we pull that would just like unravel the whole thing so that we can start again and have, a more effective sector in order to do this really important work that we're doing. And the board is, I think, one of those threads that people think like, if we just pull this, although it's really complicated. I'm thinking about like foundations. Whenever I say, look, you need to give more general operating funds, it needs to be multi-year, etc. And they go, and even the CEOs go, well, that's the board. What can I do? It's just the board. It's not just the board. You're the CEO, all right? And you're paid $500,000 a year salary in Seattle. That's what a lot of these foundation CEOs are paid. Gates and others, like literally $700,000 a year. Why would they have any incentive to rock the boat? So then they use the board as an excuse to not change. And we need to understand those power dynamics at the same time so that we do not let them get away with just saying, like, it's just my board. What can I possibly do? You're still the leader. You need to understand that, right? As the CEO of a foundation, you have to understand your role in it, and that's what we expect of you. But it's also, yes, the boards are very problematic. They really are. They're terrible. This is one of the worst structures that we have, and we've just accepted that this is the only way it can be. What other structures can we have? I'm writing a book now, and one of the chapters is like really about reimagining boards, and it starts with an anecdote of how I made one of the worst mistakes of my sort of leadership career. Is that when I founded my last organization, we had this amazing, robust board. It met quarterly, and it was like 30 or 40 people every single time. And it was full of kids and food, and there was childcare provided, and the energy was eclectic, and it was so much fun. There were 9 committees that were focusing on doing everything to set up this organization. People were so engaged. We never had it. We ran out of room for people to attend because it was just so well attended. And that board selected our values and our strategic direction and our logo and everything. And it was amazing. And then as we got more and more funding, I decided that we needed a traditional board of 9 people that met once a month. And that's what we established. And they became assholes. Like, this is these individuals that I handpicked became assholes. And nearly drove me to resign several times. And like, the board structure is a structure that turns nice people into assholes. And a lot of us who are really good people are just constantly resisting that, the pull of being an asshole. But that's what it does as a default. So we have to kind of start reimagining what we can actually do and give ourselves permission to explore some new board model, like the minimally viable board, which is maybe a board of just like 3 people who do the very minimal legal requirements of a board. And that's all they do. They just meet once a month to approve the 990 or whatever it is. And that might be combined with a community board, like the one I had at my last organization, which is robust. They don't have any legal power whatsoever, but they're the ones driving the strategies and the values of the organization. So there are other board structures that we can look at. We do not need to be married to this traditional and really terrible board structure.
Do you have any good examples of other board structures that have worked or organizations you can point to?
I am starting to ferret them out for the book and
Yeah.
interviewing them. There is a group called Ontario Nonprofit Network that is leading a project called Reimagining Governance. So I recommend that you check them out, Ontario Nonprofit Network. And they probably would have some examples of organizations doing cool things with boards. But again, I don't know. My last organization worked out really well until I was not smart enough and changed it to be a more traditional board structure here.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, I think that's interesting, especially because I'm thinking about some of the organization that I chair. That could be an interesting model for that. I'd love to hear if any of you on the call have thought about that. Well, one of the other questions I have is humor plays a big role in your writing, which we all love. How do you think humor can be leveraged to tackle serious issues in our sector? And how have you found to weave that in? Was that just come naturally to you? Or yeah,
Yeah, The humor thing, I don't know. I've always been a class clown type, I guess. That was how I dealt with my introversion, is by becoming humorous, and yeah, and that's how I've always been. It can be very helpful, and it helps to deliver messages more effectively. Sometimes very serious messages, and so I think we strive to do that more often. And we have a lot of very funny people in the sector. I think about like the those airlines safety videos. I don't know if they play them anymore. Like I think they kind of stopped, but for a while they were always like all these funny videos of like nuns dancing down the aisle as they explain the seatbelts and stuff. And I always really appreciated them because this was like a safety message demonstrated in very creative ways. And we need to start doing that more often. I think about like how these different shows that we have, like Abbott Elementary, which is one of my favorite shows because it's so great. And it's about educators in a mostly black school district in Philadelphia. And it shows their lives and it uses a lot of humor, but it's also very educational and helps with advocacy because people are like, well, do you see, like this is what teachers have to deal with. And our sector does not have enough of that. We don't have a show about that's really primarily focused on nonprofit work, for example, right? I mean, we have like social workers who are portrayed in various shows, but it's always inaccurate. It's usually someone trying to remove kids from their families, which has been sealed in the minds of the public is this is what a social worker does. They remove kids from their families,
Right.
which is very inaccurate. Sometimes they really do need to do that, but that's not all social workers do. Speaking as someone who has a master's in social work, right? So we do need to be more creative in how we deliver our messages. And yeah, I guess that's all. I mean, the baby animals, the jokes, the references to Game of Thrones, maybe not the last few seasons because they were terrible.
Well, I think
But
I wish there was a
yeah.
Parks and Recs because I'm an advocacy person, so I love Veep and Parks and Recs because I think they're humorous, but they show. I mean, a lot of that stuff is like what happens when you work at a city council, or you work for an elected. And I wish we had a Parks and Recs for the nonprofit sector. So maybe one of the bright people here can do that. That can be your second season of life career. And since the Iowa Nonprofit Alliance is really young, that was something we talked about. I said, we have a challenge that we haven't been around a long time. And so some people don't think we're a proven organization, even though nonprofit associations have been around for Illinois 75 years, Minnesota 50 years. But one of the things that we do get to do is we get to have a fun, engaging voice. We don't have to have this really traditional I mean, we're serious, but I want to have levity to it. And so that's something we really made a conscious decision here at the INA, is to kind of bring that spirit of levity and humor, and that we work hard, but we're also fun people. So that was something that when I've talked to my other colleagues around the country, I feel really fortunate because they can't necessarily do that on a dime. And I'm like, we're going to start this way with this really, a fun voice and try to be that, bring joy to people's lives, hopefully a little bit. All right, awesome. Jordan, who is our president, the INA president, has a question. So Jordan, welcome.
This has nothing to do with being funny.
Okay.
This is going back to the conversation about board structure. And I can really resonate with what Vu was saying. In my own organization, we've gone through a lot of different iterations of what does the board do? How does it work? What function does it play? What role does it play? And like Vu, I founded this organization, but interactions with the board almost drove me to resign a couple times. But instead decided, let's push through and figure out a better way to structure this board. And Vu, we actually moved toward that governance only model. My board meets 2 times a year to take care of governance issues, 1 time a year to approve the next year's budget. And then we engage community stakeholder groups in a continuous innovation process to actually determine programming and strategy and what the needs are, identify gaps. And we've been doing that now for 3.5, almost 4 years, and I've never been happier. And my board has never been happier because they all appreciate that they have a very clear role, minimal drama as volunteers, no hard issues really ever to think about. And they're happy. The organization's performing better than ever. And we have now this very broad network of community stakeholders that have voice in what we do with the resources that we have in order to affect change. And so I would encourage anyone out there who has the ability, I know not everybody has the ability, but to enter into a candid conversation with your board and just say, are we the best version of ourselves? And if not, how do we get there?
That's great. Thanks, Jordan.
That's awesome, Jordan. I might need to reach out to you just to hear more about your experience.
I can connect you. As we kind of come to the end, I just have a couple things on for someone just starting out in the nonprofit world. What's the one piece of advice you'd give them to navigate the complexities of the sector? What's your one for new nonprofit leaders?
I would say everything is made up. Okay, like the entire sector is like Taco Tuesday. Like this is these are all suggestions that we're dealing with. So when people are like, well, this is what you should do, a board should do this, and you should say this when you talk to a funder, and you should it's all Taco Tuesday. Which is like it's a suggestion, it's a tradition that we like because it alliterates, it's nice to say, and it's comforting, but we're not married to it. We shouldn't be. And we're losing a lot of young people because we are, and also more experienced people who are just very tired because they go into the sector to change things, and they're just told this is how you do things. That's just like this crappy, ineffective way. That's just how we've always done it, and we're just going to continue doing it. We wonder why people don't want to come into the sector, why we're losing people, why no one wants to be a nonprofit leader anymore. It's because they go into this work and they're told, sorry, that's just not how we do things here. And it's something that I try to encourage people to think about. Like, this is all made up. The way we do fundraising is made up. The way we engage with board is all made up. The way the philanthropy is all made up. The way that we communicate, everything is all made up. What that means is that you can also make up stuff too. Okay, like your idea is just as valid as all this other made up stuff that people have been making up. And so that's one thing I would say to younger people. The other thing I would say is this work unfortunately is always going to be around. So it's important for you to spend time with your family. And I think about this quote that someone did where maybe it's not a quote, maybe it was a commercial for an alcoholic beverage around the holidays. But I think it was Heineken. I think Heineken did this, where they were like, let's calculate how much time you have left with the people in your lives. How often do you see your dad? And they're like, oh, I see him once a year for 5 days during Christmas, and then maybe 2 days, during Thanksgiving or whatever, because he lives out of state. I'm like, okay, so the commercial's like, okay, so you see your dad 7 days or so a year. Okay. How old is he? He's 75. Okay, well, based on statistics, he has about 10 more years left. So 10 years, multiply that by 8 is 7 days. You have about 70 days left with your dad. And, so they just did this with a whole bunch of people. And people are like, oh my gosh, I only have 48 days left with my mom. I have 122 days left with my grandma or whatever it is. And then they drink Heineken and get very depressed. So
They drink their fears, their troubles away.
it was to encourage them to get together to drink Heineken. But the point is that we don't have a lot of time left with the people. It's an illusion to think that we have all this time left. And it was really shocking to me. So this work that we do is incredible and so important. But so many of us are spending way more time with our coworkers and with grants and reports and budgets than we are with the people that we love.
Right.
So I would say like that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we do this work.
Well, and that's what I really love about the young people that I work with that are coming up. But they have the ones I work, they have such a different view of work-life balance. I think that they have a view of work-life balance. And I love that they're pressuring and putting pressure on me as an older leader and other older leaders to say, hey, this isn't how I want to operate my life. And we're going to have to restructure this and refigure this out. I just love that. I love that. And a lot of people get frustrated, and we see it in the Facebook groups. Like, I have a young person, or I'm not gonna say just all young people, but a worker who doesn't want to work on the weekends or doesn't want to work 80 hours a week, and they're upset. I'm like, good for them. We should be figuring that is good that they're bringing this up. We should be helping figuring this out. This has been dysfunctional for a while.
It has been. The other thing I would say is about the audacity of ambition. I want us to dream bigger.
Yes.
And we don't, we've been beaten down, and we've developed this learned helplessness when it comes to this work, this very apologetic attitude that we have in doing this work. And we feel bad if we ask for a lot of money and we think we don't deserve this money, and etc., because it's other people's money and there's only so much of it to go around, which again are complete lies. But I think about, and I always bring up Juicero, which is a Wi-Fi connected juicing machine that some of you may not have heard of. But it was a $700 machine that came out of Silicon Valley. And you have to subscribe to these proprietary packets of cut up fruit and vegetables for $8 each. And you place a packet into this machine and it squeezes out 1 glass of juice. Bloomberg did an investigation where they took the packets and squeezed them by hand and got about the same amount of juice, but faster. And they wrote about this, and Juicero plummeted. But before they went bankrupt, they were boasting that they had $120 million in venture capital, that they had 50 full-time engineers working to design this Wi-Fi connected juicing machine. Meanwhile, some of us are like, can we please get $19 to end poverty? And homelessness. Like, and then the funders are like, oh, we'll give you $2 that you can only spend on paper clips on Tuesdays because we're saving up for a rainy day. And then we're like, okay, we'll send you a handwritten thank you note. Like, it's all warped, it's twisted, because the work that all of us are doing is way more important than a Wi-Fi connected juicing machine. And yet we're the ones being apologetic and defensive about it. So what I would encourage young people is like, stop it. Your work is way more important. Add a 0 or 2 zeros to your ask and stop apologizing for it. You may not get it, but eventually we need to start training funders to understand that this work is way more important than some of the shitty things that they and the rest of society have been focusing on.
Hear, hear. So totally agree with our last few minutes. I just want to bring up a couple of things that have been come to the surface, a couple of things that INA has coming out. So Vu talked a lot about voter engagement and how important it is for nonprofits to engage in voter engagement activities. This week in the INA newsletter, the In a Minute, which is not a fun name, the INA Minute, the In a Minute. We had a contest for that, by the way. I was like, I'm not going to be able to name this newsletter. And that's what our people like anyway, you guys are so creative. And so thank you. So the In a Minute on this Friday, we're going to have an Iowa nonprofit voter guide, voter engagement toolkit that you can use. We know that when nonprofits engage people in voter education activities, get out the vote, voter registration, early voting, that we have a more democratized voting system. We know that more under served communities vote, more people of color, more LGBTQ people, more people with limited incomes. We know that there's great research out there. And we know another thing is that there has been a lack of trust in information givers. I say like the media, other people, but people still trust their nonprofits. They still trust you. They still look to you to tell them about the communities that you serve and the great work that you're doing. And if you let them know that voting is important, they will listen to you. You are a messenger that people really listen and value, especially your stakeholders, your donors, your volunteers, et cetera. So look for that. We also will be doing a sector-wide survey to gather the input on good, bad funder practices and perhaps use that for some advocacy with our funder community. So stay tuned for that later this year. Of course, we have our policy and advocacy cabinet that we'd love for you to be a part of. And we have our summit. Vu was our keynote speaker last year, and we have a summit coming up in October with some other great keynotes. So we hope that we will check that out. Thank you so much for being here, Vu. Thank you for being here, for the work you do and the voice, your unapologetic voice. And thank you for all the Iowa nonprofits for the work that you do here to build up our communities and make them great and strong and make Iowa a great place to live. We just appreciate you so much. And know that there is someone who wakes up every day, that's me, and thinks, how is Iowa's nonprofit sector doing today? I am that person who thinks that every single day for you. We'll put out a recording of this. I'm also just brainstorming. We could have it as be like a little audio version so you can listen to it on your way to work, or if you just want to get roused up before you head into the office. So we'll be sending that out to everyone who all of our members. Oh, and Paul, thank you. We are 16th in voter registration. We can reach the top with 1.8% more. That's what, I don't know. Isn't that like 3 Iowans? I don't know. 1.8% of the population.
I wasn't gonna make that joke, but I'm glad you did. That's like, yeah.
You're welcome. Yes, I think that's not very many Iowans, 1.8%. That's just a family in Iowa. So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for being part of the INA. Have a great rest of the week. Thank you, Vu.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great weekend, or whatever. What day is it? I don't.
It's Tuesday, but that's okay.
It's only Tuesday. Okay.
Have a great week.
Bye, everyone.